Hello students, this is Dr. Esmacher, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to write a better quality essay. In your History 23-21 class this week, you'll have your second writing assignment, the Connecting the Past essay. So I wanted to go over with you a few tips and tricks for writing a better quality essay. First and foremost, the best individual recommendations for you writing a better essay come from the feedback from your first essay. So please make sure as you're getting prepared to turn in this week's essay that you first go back and look at your feedback from your first essay that you submitted. If you're unclear on anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to me for clarification. I'm going to talk about some sort of general ways to improve essay writing today. But again, if you want sort of more personal tips on where areas that you personally can strengthen, please look at the feedback that I gave you. And if it's unclear, please reach out to me and don't wait until the last minute to do so. So let's talk about writing a better essay. First off, since you have to take English 1301 before you take this class, you will probably already be familiar with how to write a basic essay. So most English professors still teach what we call the basic 5-paragraph essay structure. So this is about essay organization. So the 5-paragraph essay is sort of a good rule of thumb to adopt as a guideline for essay writing, but it doesn't have to be exactly 5 paragraphs. So the nice thing about the 5-paragraph essay is it kind of gives you a good structure base for all of your essay writing. The idea is that every essay should always include an introduction with your thesis statement. Okay, so you can't just jump right into the content. You've got to give a little bit of a primer on what you're going to cover in the rest of your essay. The body paragraphs should always include evidence that refers back to your introduction and thesis statement to help prove the point that you're making in your thesis. Now, the 5-paragraph essay structure suggests 3 body paragraphs, but that's really kind of the most adaptable part of this essay organization. I wouldn't go less than 3, but you can definitely go longer, especially if you're having to write a longer essay or a research paper for another class. Then you always wrap up an essay with a conclusion where you restate your thesis. Again, it's kind of important to not just sort of drop off in the middle of nowhere in your essay, but to kind of pause and reflect back on what you've written, and again, to revisit your thesis statement to really kind of hammer home the points that you're making with the evidence that you provided in your body paragraphs. So if one of the feedback comments that you got on your first essay was that you had trouble with organization, it's worth coming back to this 5-paragraph structure because it's a classic for a reason. If you jumped around from point to point in evidence, maybe that's a suggestion that you need to go back in and make sure that you have body paragraph number 1 devoted to one particular thing you're going to talk about, and then shift focus for the next body paragraph, and so on and so forth. In other words, make sure your information is organized within that middle section of the essay. Otherwise, if you have introduction, conclusion, and then the middle's all jumbled together, it's going to be hard for me to read, and it's going to be difficult for your points to come across in your essay. Now, the thesis is one of the most important parts of your essay. This is where you're going to lay out an argument that you are going to support with evidence. So most history essays, especially the ones from my class, are examples of what we call persuasive essays if you've taken English 1301. You are trying to make a point and support that point with evidence. So in the case of history essays, you are writing based on what the historical evidence suggests. I'm sorry, Mateo just knocked down some books on the floor because he thinks he's very tiny. He is, in fact, a huge German Shepherd who does not fit very well under my desk, but he tries. Anyways, before Mateo started knocking stuff over, what I was saying is that the thesis is really central because that's where you're going to kind of make your claim, right? It's not like an opinion essay where you're saying things like, I think Tom Holland is the best Spider-Man. Instead, here you're making a claim, but that claim has to be supported with historical evidence. So the thesis is really important. Think of it as your trailer, your movie trailer, right? You see movie trailers in theaters or today during the time of a pandemic on YouTube, and it's designed to give you a taste of what the movie is like, right? To give you some anticipation for seeing the full product. So think of your thesis as a taste of what you're going to be arguing in your essay. So because of that, it is really important to have a strong thesis. So let's go over some thesis statements that I see very often, and I'm using an example from one of your essay prompts. So the first example of a very weak thesis, it's a thesis, but it's not very good, is the Greeks and Romans were similar yet different. If I took a shot for every time I saw a thesis statement that said these things were similar yet different, I would have died of alcohol poisoning a long time ago. This is a very popular but very, very weak thesis. One of the reasons it's weak is you're not really telling me any information in it. You're just saying, okay, they're different, but in some ways they're similar. Well, you could say that of pretty much anything, right? You're not telling me any of the ways in which these specific two groups are similar. These specific two groups are different, right? So a stronger version, if you want to take that thesis and make it a little bit stronger, is saying the Greeks were not as powerful as the Romans. Okay, that's still pretty vague because you're not telling me what powerful means or giving me an example of powerful. But at least it's better than these things are similar yet different, because here you're giving me a difference between them, even if that difference is very, very weak. So let's capitalize, let's make that better, right? If we're going to talk about a difference in power, let's try to take that and make it a little bit stronger. So an example of a strong thesis, if we're kind of operating on this idea of power and difference, is the Greek Empire collapsed relatively quickly, but the Roman Empire lasted due to its habit of including conquered people and citizenship. So the reason that this is a strong thesis is you're giving me a difference between the two, but you're also explaining why that difference exists, right? So in this case, you're saying, okay, you're not necessarily saying why the Greeks collapsed relatively quickly, but you are giving the reason for the Roman difference, right, is being more inclusive of the people that they conquer. So that would be an example of a stronger thesis. And if you had this thesis for your essay, then you would have to go through in your body paragraphs and tell me why the Greek Empire collapsed relatively quickly. How the Romans exactly included conquered peoples in citizenship, right? So you'd have to revisit different pieces of your thesis throughout your body paragraphs. So keep that in mind when you're constructing your essay, that you really want to start off with a good, strong thesis. And I imagine at this point that you're probably like, well, but I've written papers for classes before, and I start out with a thesis, and then I get to writing, and then I realize that what I wrote doesn't necessarily match my thesis. That's okay. You can go back and modify your thesis. You can change it. Every single person who's ever written a paper has probably done that multiple times. When I wrote my dissertation, it was 333 pages when it was done. And I certainly went back and tweaked my thesis and my introduction after I had finished writing everything to make sure that it was better and was a better fit. So there's no shame in doing that. You are not completely wed to the first thesis statement you think of. If you write through your essay and you come back and go, you know, I can improve my thesis, I could make it match better, go back and do it. That's perfectly fine. Again, that is something that most people do. So make sure in your essay that you have a clear organization. You can use kind of the basic 5-paragraph essay structure to help you there. Make sure that you have a good, strong thesis statement. And if you go through, again, you can go through the same exercise that I just went through with you on this slide of taking a thesis, kind of throwing out your first idea for a thesis and tweaking it to make it stronger. And those two things alone will really kind of help better structure your writing and help your arguments become much clearer, right? Because you're going to spend your body paragraph supporting your thesis, and it helps if you have a clear thesis, a clear direction to where you're going to be going in your writing. So let's take a moment to look at your essay prompts. In particular, I'm going to go over your essay prompts with you for this upcoming essay so you can kind of see the ways in which we interpret questions. Because one of the big problems I noticed across the board with the first round of essays this semester, not just in y'all's class, but in other classes too, was people misunderstanding what the prompt was asking. That's really important. You need to understand what you're being asked to do. And if you don't understand it, then you can run into problems because then you're writing an essay that doesn't match what you were asked. So let's go over these prompts together. So you have 2 prompts you can choose from this week. Do not pick both and try to do both. Especially don't try to do both of them mashed up together. It does not end well. Pick one, just one. All right, so here's the first essay prompt that you have as an option. It says, historically, the early history of the Americas, Oceania, and Sub-Saharan Africa has been understudied and underemphasized. Write an essay comparing 2 of these regions prior to 500 CE. What common trends of development do you see between these regions? What factors are unique? How do they compare to Europe, Asia, and North Africa prior to the end of the Bronze Age, 600 BCE? Why do we continue to not emphasize these regions in K-12 education today? All right, let's unpack this a little bit. So you'll notice that the first sentence in your essay is just a statement. It's not a question, right? It just says, we don't look at these areas in history very often. That's all it says, okay? So that's kind of laying the groundwork for the question. All right, then we have in bold the main direction of your essay. You're going to write an essay comparing 2 of these regions prior to 500 CE. So here you're given a goal, a task. You have to compare, right? So here again, talk about similarities and differences, 2 of these regions. Now notice the first sentence gives you 3 different regions, okay? The Americas, Oceania, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So in other words, you don't have to talk about all 3, but you have to talk about 2 of those, okay? And please notice it gives you a time period prior to 500 CE. So what this means is you have to pay attention to the information that you're using to support whatever argument you're making. You have to make sure that that information comes from before 500 CE. Okay? So this is the main goal of your essay. All of these questions that follow are sub-questions. And they're designed to get you to think about what kinds of information that you could include. So for example, what common trends of development, okay, do you see between these regions? So in other words, where are they similar? Okay. What factors are unique? That's where you talk about where they're different from one another. How do they compare to Europe, Asia, and North Africa prior to the end of the Bronze Age? Okay. So again, you're comparing here, so similarity and difference with other regions. Okay, Europe, North Africa, and Asia. And then look here, though, you got to be careful because this one says prior to the end of the Bronze Age. Note that that is not the same time period as the main point of your essay. Remember, the main goal of your essay is to look at these regions up to 500 CE, but when it asks you to compare these regions with these other places, the date is different. It's up to 600 BCE. Right? So there's a 1,000-year difference going on between these 2. So make sure you're mindful of that, because if you just go, oh, 500 CE, and that's the date stuck in your head, and you get to that part where you're comparing these regions to Europe, Asia, and North Africa, and you start talking about, you know, say the Roman Empire, that's going to be out of time period, right? Because this asks you to compare only through the Bronze Age in these regions. Now, the last question is what I call the connecting part. Remember, they're called connecting the past essays, so you want to talk about how the past connects to the present. So when you're looking at this particular piece, put this in the conclusion. Okay, I cannot emphasize this enough. Put this in the conclusion. You want to be very careful that you spend the bulk of your essay talking about the time period you're supposed to be talking about. And drawing connections to the present is just a way to wrap up your essay. It's not the main goal of your essay. So the last thing I want you to do is to write an entire essay about why we don't talk about these things today and then not talk a lot about the material you're supposed to cover, right? Hopefully, if you have a good thesis statement, you'll make a claim about why these areas are understudied. You'll go through and talk about all the things that we know about them and then revisit that claim in your conclusion to be like, okay, if they did all of these things that I talked about in the body paragraphs, why do we still ignore them, right? So you always want to make that question that explicitly asks you to connect to present. You always want to address that in your conclusion. So that way you avoid the trap of spending your entire essay talking about the present. But you really don't want to do that. This is a class based on your knowledge on the past. You're really trying to kind of figure out how you can showcase your knowledge of the material that we've covered from these time periods. Okay, so when you look at an essay, make sure you understand what the parameters are of your essay prompt. In this case, it's telling you to compare only 2 of 3 given regions, and it's giving you a time period to look at. One of the biggest mistakes I saw from the first batch of essay were people ignoring the time period. So like, for example, the human evolution one, people were telling me about the invention of farming and the invention of complex civilization in cities. That happened after the Neolithic. And if that was mentioned just in your conclusion as a way to kind of be like, and then this will eventually happen, great. But a lot of people were making the discussion of farming and cities the centerpiece of their essay when that doesn't fit in the time period of the essay prompt. So be really careful about that. Now we're going to move on to the second prompt. All right, so here again, we have this sentence that is just a statement, kind of setting the scene. The classical era, 500 BCE to 500 CE, is a time period dominated by large regional empires in Afro-Eurasia. Okay, statement. We're setting the scene here. We're going to talk about large regional empires. And then you have your directions. Write an essay comparing 2 of the following empires, the Achaemenid or Persian Empire, the Greek Empire of Alexander and his generals, the Roman Empire, and the Mauryan Empire. Now, again, notice we have a stipulation here that you're only picking 2 of these. Okay, so you have 4 options, but you're only picking 2. And then we also have a time period, not explicitly given to us in this sentence, but in the setup sentence, that we're going to be talking about the classical era. So you have a 1,000-year span here from 500 BCE to 500 CE to talk about. Okay, so we're picking 2 empires and we're following the course of them over this 1,000-year period of time. Okay, similar to the last question, then we have sub-questions, okay, which are designed to get us to think about how we can compare these. So one of these is, did they have any similar methods for conquest or governance? Okay, so here we're talking about similarities, right? Similar methods for conquest or governance. So it's important to kind of focus on this point. Conquest is how we set up an empire, right? How we gain territory. That's a very different process than how you run that territory after you get it. That's the governance piece of it. So that should be a tip off to you that you not only need to talk about how these empires establish themselves, but you also need to talk about how these empires try to run themselves after that they're established, because it is far easier to conquer territory than it is to hang on to it effectively. So you want to make sure you talk about both things. The next question, how did these empires facilitate the spread of religion, ideas, and trade across their borders? So here you're talking about cultural exchange, economic exchange between these areas. So that's where you can, again, kind of have to pay attention to the time period, 500 BCE to 500 CE. Depending upon the empires we're going to look at, there's lots of polytheistic religious beliefs involved with the Greeks and the Romans. The Mayans, your textbook talks about not only Hinduism, but also the rise of Buddhism, and talks about emperors like Ashoka, right, who converted to Buddhism and then kind of made it his mission to spread Buddhism throughout his empire. The Persians, your textbook talks about being affiliated with the religion of Zoroastrianism. And then in the Romans, kind of the tail end of their empire, you can also talk about the evolution of Christianity, right? That Christianity exists around the time period shift between the BCE and CE, right? So it's a later introduction to the Romans, and Christianity does not become immediately popular in the Roman Empire. In fact, because we go up to 500 CE, you could talk about, if you're talking about the Romans, you could talk about Emperor Constantine and his conversion to Christianity and his sort of trying to formalize a Christian church, a sort of standard Christianity in his empire. Okay. And then again, the last question is the question that gets you to draw connections between past and present. And once again, that should be tossed into your conclusion. Okay, so this piece is definitely a subjective question, right? What are some of the lasting legacies from these empires today? So if you wanted to say something like, well, the Romans gave us concrete, we're still using concrete a bunch, you could say that. If you wanted to say, well, we still have lots of Greek philosophy, you know, like we still use the Socratic method, for example, in teaching, or we still use Aristotle's logic as the basis of the scientific method. You can totally do that. This is the piece of the essay where you don't have to talk about everything and the kitchen sink. You can kind of focus on some things that stick out to you as apparent lasting legacies from these empires. So again, when you're making the connections to the present, make sure that's the conclusion. You don't want the connections to the present overwhelming the main body of your essay. You really want to spend most of your time talking about the conquest of these empires, how they run their empires, what kinds of cultural exchange do they have within the empire and outside of the empire. That's the kind of stuff you want to focus on, and this is the meat and potatoes for this essay. Again, you do not have to write on all 4 empires. You only have to pick 2 to write on for this essay. And again, pay attention to the time period, 500 BCE to 500 CE. That's a pretty wide-ranging time period. You can do a lot with that time period, but make sure you don't exceed that time period, okay, or go too early. So I hope that this little tutorial was helpful for you in breaking down the options that you have for this week, and hopefully in structuring better essays. Writing better essays is important. Developing as a writer, a better writer, is important. It's a process that we continue throughout our lives, improving on communicating with others. And the more time you take to organizing your essay in a logical way, to paying attention to what your essay is asking and responding to that, the easier time you will have in writing, the easier time I will have in reading it, and the easier your communication and your ideas will come across to me as your reader, and hopefully the better your score will be. So thank you guys very much for watching and listening. I look forward to reading some real kick-butt essays from you guys this week. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me on Blackboard. And remember, you can get extra credit on your essays if you take them to the Writing Center or the Tutoring Center virtually. The information for those services is in our Blackboard course page, and you can either take a screenshot of tutoring or CC me on your email to the Writing Center. Have a fantastic day.